Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. We move forward with summing up and discussion. In module 7, we were looking at markets, welfare, and conservation. And we looked at surplus, market efficiency, cost of taxation, and international trade. Now, in this case, it is important for us to realize that markets are there because they increase the surplus, they increase the welfare for the society. And so, even if markets are making a bad economic choice, they are making a bad decision that is leading to problems for in the environment, we just cannot brush the markets away. They are a reality. And they are a reality precisely because they help people, they help the society. And so we just cannot blame the markets. We will have to understand the market and find out a way so that the markets behave in a manner that is good for the society and that is also good for the environment. Because after all, when we say that we are working for the environment, we are trying to conserve the environment, we are conserving the environment primarily for the people. Because a good environment provides certain benefits to people in the form of ecosystem services, clean air, clean water, perennial rivers, uh, control over soil erosion, and the biodiversity benefits. And we are conserving the environment to provide these benefits to the society. So, when there is a good environment, it also increases the surplus. Now, if the economist does not understand the value of the environment, then it is possible to shortchange the environment and just look at only some factors that increase the surplus. That is, the economist might go on with a solution that has externalities, primarily negative externalities, for the society and for the environment. And this is where the role of the conservationist comes in. The conservationist needs to understand the market so as to be able to talk to the economist in common language and bring out or highlight the importance of the environment in increasing the surplus of the society. And so it is very important for us to understand how markets work and where conservation fits in. Now, in this, we began with surplus and we asked this question, what makes the buyers purchase things? And the most important realization is that the people, in the case of a market, make decisions. The buyer makes a decision based on the value of things. So, if the buyer places a lot of value to something and it is available at a lower price, then the buyer purchases it. And so that increases the surplus of the buyer or the welfare of the buyer. Now, two things here are important. One is the value that the buyer is putting in, and two, the price at which the thing is available in the market. And the important thing is the buyer purchases only when the value is greater than the price. That is, if we want the buyers to purchase those things that are environmentally friendly, that have been extracted using sustainable principles, that have been extracted using managed natural resources to ensure that we are not overutilizing the resources, we are not over harvesting, then we need to work on the value that people put on it. That is, when we talk about a market, and we need to understand that the transaction will happen in a market, it will not happen outside of the market. And in the market, when there are different products, we need to ensure that the value that is put on a thing that is sustainably harvested or sustainably produced is high. And that can be done through things such as advertisements or through education or through awareness activities. Similarly, a seller sells only when the price is greater than the cost of production, because the seller also wants to increase their surplus. The seller is trying to increase the profits, and profits are only possible when the price is greater than the cost of production. Now, what happens in a number of cases is that if you do um, a management that is sustainable management, then typically the cost of production is a bit higher than if you were doing an unsustainable production. That is to say, if you have a forest and there are two options. One is to cut all trees. Now, in this case, if somebody goes with this option to cut all the trees, then things are very simple. Take all the equipment, cut whatever trees are available so that you are able to extract the maximum trees out. In this case, 100% of the trees. The amount or the density of management is very high because you take your equipment once and you are able to extract a large quantity of trees. But then this is an unsustainable management and unsustainable harvesting. But because you only have to go to the forest once and cut all the trees, so it becomes more cost effective, especially in the short run. The second option is to go with the scientific management. Now, in this case, what happens is that we go to the forest, we measure the trees, in which case we also note down whether a tree is a diseased tree, whether a tree is a dying tree or a dead tree, and we try to extract those trees out. And we are doing that to make space for the growth of the next generation. And we only harvest a fraction of the trees that are there in the forest, leaving out sufficient number of mature trees so that adequate amount of seeds are produced and the next generation is produced. And this will lead to a sustainable management of forest because we will be able to harvest the forest for many years. So this scientific management leads to a sustainable harvest, whereas cutting all the trees might lead to a unsustainable harvest. But the thing is, when we were doing the unsustainable harvest, we only had to take the equipment once and cut down all the trees. So the density of operations is high, and so it becomes more cost effective. In the case of sustainable management, there are other costs that are involved. Going to the forest for a surveying, marking the trees, choose which trees to cut, and cutting only a small fraction of trees, which means that we will have to visit the forest every year or say every nth years. And so the density of operations here is less. And less density of operations means that you will have to take the equipment again and again, which increases the cost of production. Now, the thing here is the seller is only going to sell if the price is greater than the cost of production. Now, this brings us to a point that for a market, the value to customer should be greater than the price, which should be greater than the cost of production. And we have observed that in the case of a sustainable harvesting, the cost of production is higher. So this is the reason why a lot of unsustainable practices go on happening in the market. So when we understand the working of the market, we can say that, okay, we need to increase the value to the customers through, say, advertisement or education or awareness drives to make them understand that, okay, if there is something that is that has this label about sustainable harvest, it means that if you purchase these things, then your forest or the natural resources will be maintained sustainably, and you will have these resources for your generation, for the next generation, and so on. So you should put a higher value to these things. Only then will the customer buy the things. And at the same time, we need to put the cost of productions down. And so, because we know that the sustainable harvest requires greater number of operations, lesser concentration of management, so there is a role of government here. The government will need to subsidize these operations, or the government will need to tax the other operations that are not sustainable, so that the cost of production of doing things unsustainably it increases, and the cost of production of doing things sustainably it goes down. So markets give us this understanding of what needs to be done. So in the case of a market, a buyer purchases only when he or she gets a consumer surplus, which means that the value is greater than the price, and the seller sells only when the cost of production is less than the price. And in this case, we looked at two things. The producer surplus is the triangle or this area that is between the price and the supply line. And the consumer surplus is this triangle between the price and the demand curve. And the study of markets gives us this realization that both are trying to maximize the surplus. And the maximum surplus for both the buyers and sellers happens at the market equilibrium. And at that point, we have the situation that the consumer surplus is maximized and the producer surplus also is maximized. And this is the measure of a benefit that the buyers and the sellers are themselves perceiving it. So essentially, we are not telling the buyers and the sellers that you should buy such and such thing because this is good for you, but they are perceiving it themselves. So that makes market the most important factor in economics. So markets are going to stay, and we need to play with this knowledge that the markets are there to stay, and we need to fit in our conservation oriented policies into the markets so that conservation also happens and sustainable management also happens. In the next lecture, we looked at the market efficiency and the cost of taxation. And we said that the total surplus is the sum of the consumer surplus and the producer surplus and is given by this triangle. And for a society, we will have an efficient production or an efficient market when the total surplus is maximized. So the goal of the government is to maximize the total surplus. Now remember that when we said that the government can use things like taxes and subsidies, there is also a cost involved though. And that cost is the cost of the dead weight. So what happens is that if we tax something, so when we say that we are going to tax things that are being produced unsustainably, in that case, the government will extract a revenue which is given by this rectangle, which is the size of the tax multiplied by the quantity that is sold. So this is the tax revenue. But this also creates a deadweight loss, which is given by this triangle. Now, deadweight loss comprises the loss of those values or those surplus that is accruing neither to the buyer, nor to the seller, nor to the government. Because with the case of taxes, these transactions themselves are not happening. So this is a deadweight loss. Now, deadweight loss, the concept is important because we need to understand that whenever there is a taxation or a subsidy, there is going to be a deadweight loss. And if we do not understand the value of conservation, the value of sustainable harvest, then there could be a situation where the economist says that, okay, there is a deadweight loss, so we are not going to do this. Now, herein comes the role of the conservationist to highlight the fact that, okay, there is a deadweight loss, but then the benefits of the sustainable harvest will ensure that we will have the surplus for a very long period of time. That is what is happening here, is that in the case of unsustainable harvest, we could have a situation in which, say, we have um, 1000 units of surplus and we are going to have it for 1 year. Now, that is the surplus that we will have because of the unsustainable harvest. But when we go for a harvest that is sustainable, now in this case, because of the deadweight loss that is there because we were using taxation and subsidies to ensure that the sustainable harvest is what gets sold in the market. Now, in this case, the surplus would reduce. So, in case of 1000 units, probably we will only have 800 units of the surplus. But then we will have these 800 units of surplus for infinite number of years. So every year we will be having 800 units of surplus, whereas in the case of unsustainable harvest, there is a higher surplus, but then once the resource is gone, then there is no more surplus to be had from that resource. Now, if we talk in these terms, when we say that in the case of sustainable harvest, we will have a reduced quantity of surplus, but for a very long period of time, then we can ensure that the sustainable policies get used in the market or get implemented by the government. So herein comes the role of understanding the economics of the market, understanding the economics of taxation and subsidies, and using them for sustainability. So in this case, the conservationist would need to highlight the point, press upon this point that, okay, there is a deadweight loss, but even after the deadweight loss, the reduced surplus is something that we are going to get for an infinite number of years, and that too without any externalities or probably with positive externalities. So, if the conservationist does not understand the language of the economist, they would not be able to hammer this point. And in this case, we said that, okay, there is this deadweight loss. With the taxation, we have a distribution of the surpluses. So the consumer surplus reduces but becomes this. The producer surplus again reduces but becomes this triangle. This is the surplus that goes to the government, and this is the deadweight loss. Now, the important thing here is to understand that this deadweight loss also depends on the elasticity. Now, in the case of an inelastic demand and supply curve, the deadweight loss is this. If one of the curves becomes elastic, then the deadweight loss increases, whether it is the demand curve or the supply curve. And when both the curves become elastic, then the deadweight loss increases even further. So, when we are trying to use conservation, when we are trying to use sustainable harvesting, and we are mindful of this pattern that yes, there will be a deadweight loss, we need to also know that this deadweight loss will be there for those things that are elastic. The amount of deadweight loss will be greater. In the case of inelastic demand and supply curves, the deadweight loss will be a very small quantity. And so at least we can begin with by accepting the deadweight losses for the inelastic demand and supply curves. So let us make a small intrusion into the market for sustainability, at least in those fields that have inelastic demand and supply curves. So this is a learning that we had here. And we also saw that when the tax size increases, the tax revenue first of all increases, then decreases in what is known as the Laffer's curve. But as the size of the tax increases, the deadweight loss increases. It does not maximize and then come down. And so when we are using taxation, we need to be mindful of the amount of tax that we can use. So probably we cannot put a very high amount of taxation even on things that are being harvested unsustainably. But in this case, we can at least make use of other options that are available with us. Price ceilings, price floors, subsidies. So there are n number of other options that are there with the government. And remember that the government can improve upon the market outcomes, but the government will only be able to improve upon the market outcomes when we are able to convince the government that this is the improved market outcome, which is beneficial to the society. We are, after all, we are not doing conservation for the sake of conservation. We are doing conservation to ensure that our children and our grandchildren are also able to harvest the benefits of these natural resources. And so we need to understand the way economics works and we need to talk in the same terms. Now, in the next lecture, we had a look at international trade. And international trade is having a large amount of negative consequences on the environment. And in this case, we saw that the international trade has been increasing and it has also been blamed for increasing world pollution, air pollution, re, uh, undermining of national emission reduction targets, passage of disease burdens, and so on. So the international trade also has negative connotations. But then, and especially for the cause of environment, because pollution and things like diseases or the spread of diseases are bad for the environment. A thing that is bad for the environment is also bad for the society. But then we just cannot say that, okay, international trade has these negative consequences, so we are not going to have any international trade. Now, that would be taking the things at a very simplistic manner. And that would not lead us to the most optimum decisions. Because when we are saying that the international trade is having negative connotations for the environment or for the society, we also need to understand why international trade is there at all. And in this context, we saw that in the case of uh, in the case of an economy that is an exporting economy, there is a profit or an increase in surplus once there is trade. So for the exporting country, the international trade is advantageous. But we also saw that for the case of an importing country, here also the trade is advantageous because trade increases the surplus whether we are talking about an exporting country or an importing country. So we cannot just brush international trade away by saying that okay, it increases pollution, it leads to the release of greenhouse gases, and so we are going to ban it. That is just a wishful thinking. That is not going to happen. And while the government has an option of modulating it through, say, tariffs, we need to be mindful of the fact that the tariffs are going to reduce the total surplus. And so we just cannot say that, okay, we can use tariffs, so let us use tariffs. That cannot be done. So once we have this realization that international trade is going to stay because it is also bringing in benefits to the society, then we can make more informed choices. Then we can say that, okay, let us not spend or waste our time fighting international trade, but let us now try to uh, convince the buyers that even in the case of international trade, they should only go for things that are being sustainably managed. That is to say, if there is an international trade, say in paper, and you can buy paper either from a sustainably managed forest or from an unsustainably managed forest. Now, in this case, the paper from the unsustainably managed forest probably is cheaper. But then the consumers need to be made aware of the fact that, okay, even if it is being unsustainably managed, in another country, you are also going to face the consequences. Because when those forests are gone, then the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted because of deforestation, or the amount of greenhouse gases that could have been sequestered by that forest, or the biodiversity that could have been used probably by your children or your grandchildren, that is now gone. And so, even in the case of international trade, we need to emphasize that we are only going to buy things that are sustainably harvested, sustainably managed. So, let us not waste our time fighting international trade and saying that international trade is bad for the environment. Yes, it may be bad for the environment, but it also has positive connotations in terms of the of increasing the surplus of the society. So, international trade is going to stay. Let us, in place of wasting our time fighting international trade, find out other alternatives, about convincing people, about ensuring that everywhere the harvest of natural resources is happening sustainably, and also trying to make space for the increased amount of greenhouse gases emissions or the spread of pollutants that are happening because of the international trade. So let us have more forests to compensate for the amount of greenhouse gases that will be emitted by the international trade. So this learning gives us an idea upon about what is a good way to work for sustainability and what is a bad way that is not going to work. So fighting against international trade is not going to work, but finding out conservation opportunities in the context of international trade, that will probably work. And that is what we should concentrate our attention on. Next, we had a look at the public sector and conservation, and we looked at externalities, public goods and common resources, and the design of the tax system. Now, in this case, what we are saying is that there is a role of the government in improving upon the market outcomes. And this role is especially in the case of those goods or those services that are not excludable or that are not prevalent in consumption. That is to say, if we talk about the environment, clean air, clean water, then probably the market will not bring us to the most optimum output. Because if somebody is polluting the environment, then there are externalities involved. That is, the person will save on the short term cost, and the cost will be borne by the society at large, the people at large, in terms of diseases, in terms of reduced quality of life. And so, in the short term, a rational thinking might promote those activities that are bad for everybody. And a good example of that is externalities. So, if somebody is polluting the environment, that person is polluting because, in the short run, polluting the environment makes economic sense. Similarly, if we talk about positive externalities, that is, things that have a positive impact on the welfare of the bystander, in that case, the market might not emphasize the utility of that positive externality. And so the market might not promote that activity to a level that is the socially desirable level of production or consumption of that activity, and which is why we have a role of the government. So in the case of externalities, we began by saying that an externality is a market failure or a situation in which a market left on its own fails to allocate resources efficiently. Now, the primary goal of a market is to have efficient allocation of resources. That is, to have an allocation of resources such that the surplus gets maximized. That is, to, to provide goods to those consumers that have the highest value for that good, and to extract goods from those sellers that are producing it at the lowest possible cost. In that case, the surplus or the total surplus is maximized. But this allocation of resources happens through the system of prices. Now, if the market gets to a level of prices that is not leading to the most efficient allocation of resources, then we will say that this is a situation of market failure. And two such market failure situations are externalities and market power. And externalities are defined as the uncompensated impact of one person's actions on the well being of a bystander. And these externalities can be positive or negative. So, a positive externality is something that enhances the welfare of the bystander. A negative externality is something that reduces the welfare of the bystander. Production externality is something that happens during production of something. Consumption externality is something that happens during the consumption of something. And in this case, we can have a positive production externality, a positive consumption externality, or a negative production externality, or a negative consumption externality. And we looked at examples of all four of these. So, a negative production externality is something that happens during production and reduces the well being of others. Things like industrial pollution or loss of ecosystem services due to mining. And in this case, there is a deadweight loss due to the externality. In the case of the second uh, externality is the negative consumption externality. So this again reduces the well-being of others during consumption of something. And in the case of negative consumption externality as well, there is a deadweight loss. The third thing is a positive production externality. So it increases the well-being of others during production process. And in this case, again, we have a deadweight loss. And the fourth externality is a positive consumption externality. So it increases the well-being of others during the consumption process. But if the externality is not internalized, then we again have a deadweight loss. So the thing is, when we have externalities, there are deadweight losses for the society because the market is not coming to a point that enhances or maximizes the surplus of everybody. The market chooses a point when it is left to itself, the market chooses a point that is not the most optimum point. And herein comes the role of the government. The government can improve upon market outcomes by uh, internalization of the externalities. So the government might say that okay, some things that are causing a lot of negative externalities, they will not be permitted. Or the government might say that okay, let us have a system in which we will be selling pollution permits, and once these pollution permits have been sold, then people can trade them amongst themselves. Or the government may come up with quota system. How much amount of pollution can any person release? Or the market itself, in certain cases, the market or the society may also work upon these externalities to internalize them through social processes, things like boycotting of goods, or through felicitation of those actors that are providing a positive externality. Then we had a look at the public goods and common resources. And in this case, we looked at two cases. One is the case of common resources, which is the tragedy of the commons. So, what happens is that if there is a common resource and you cannot exclude people from using it, but these things are rivals in consumption. What happens is that suppose there is a grassland and people of the village can bring their cattle to the grassland. Now, in the case of a sustainable use of the grassland, people would have come up with um, a quota system that every person is able to extract so much amount of grasses. Because if you do an over exploitation of the grassland, then the grassland itself will not exist. But if we do not have such a system, if we cannot exclude people, what happens is that everybody doing a rational thinking tries to increase the number of cattle that they have. Because the positive impacts of having an extra cattle will be uh, will be had by the person who is having the extra cattle, but the negative impacts will be shared by everybody else. And so, just by taking a rational choice, people might destroy the whole of the grassland. Now, these are things that are known as common resources. We also looked at another case which people do not pay for the public goods. Now, in this context, we looked at four different kinds of goods, depending on whether or not they are excludable and whether or not they are rivals in consumption or not. Now, things that are both excludable and rivals in consumption are known as private goods. Things such as the clothes you are wearing, or things such as ice creams. So you can always say that, okay, this is my ice cream, this is my cloth, I am not going to permit you to use it. So these are private goods. Another category is club goods that are not rivals in consumption but are excludable. Things like fire protection. Certain other goods are rivals in consumption but are non-excludable, such as the environment. You cannot exclude somebody from using the environment. But if somebody overexploits the environment or pollutes the environment, then the quality of the environment for the usage of everybody else, it diminishes. So it is a rival in consumption. And we have the fourth category of goods that are non-excludable and non-rival in consumption. Things such as national defense. And in this case, we saw that there are two issues. One is the issue of the tragedy of the commons, a situation in a shared resource system where individual users, acting independently according to their own self-interest, behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or spoiling the shared resource through their collective action. Things such as overfishing and overgrazing. So in this case, everybody is acting in their own self-interest. Everybody is doing a rational thinking. But this combined rationality leads to an outcome that is bad for everybody. So this is tragedy of the commons. And we observe tragedy of the commons in the case of common resources. And there are certain solutions such as social arrangements or directly privatization of these goods. So in that case, these resources uh, turn from common resources into private resources. Or we can go for government regulation or internalization of the externalities. On the other hand, the public goods are neither excludable nor rival in consumption. And in these goods, we have the free rider problem. That is, people receive the benefit of the good but avoid paying for it. Which is the example of the society that is getting beautified. And for the beautification of the society, if it asks everybody to contribute, then it is in the best interest of each individual not to pay for it and become a free rider. Because in that case, whenever the society gets beautified, everybody will reap the benefits, whether they paid for it or not. And so, in the self interest, it makes sense not to pay for it and become a free rider. So, this is the free rider problem. And there are several solutions to the free rider problem, such as public sector provisioning of public goods. So, we can say that, okay, all the public goods will be provided for by the government, because the government is in a powerful position to collect money through taxation and to use that money for the provisioning of the public goods. Or we can make use of social norms and sanctions, or there can be certain voluntary organizations. We can make use of contracts, or we can uh, rope in the private sector to provide public goods at a cost, or we can integrate the potential free riders. So there are several options that are available. And the next thing we looked at was the design of the tax system, wherein we said that the government is using tax money for environmental protection. So when we say that the government should do a provisioning of the public goods, so one such public good is the environment in total. Now, nobody wants to pay for the environment, but they want to use the environment. And we cannot exclude people from using large chunks of the environment. Now, in that case, if we say that, okay, the government should pay for the cleaning of our oceans or for the cleaning of the land, or the government should pay for plantation activities and other stuffs, then where will the government get the money for? And the government gets the money for through taxation. So we can use government, or we can ask the government to provide for public goods through the process of taxation. And in this case, we saw that whenever there is a taxation, there is a deadweight loss that gets involved. And because of this deadweight loss, the government, in a number of cases, tries to reduce the amount of taxation. But deciding on a level of taxation is one thing. Another thing is these other considerations. Taxes increase the administrative burden for people who are filing their returns. Taxes, and especially the complications in the tax code, it may lead to confusions. And if there are loopholes, then people may make use of these loopholes. In a number of cases, the government needs to choose between efficiency or equality. And another thing is who should pay. So we have the benefits principle, which is the idea that people should pay taxes based on the benefits that they receive from the government services. That is, the rich should pay more. The another option is the ability to pay principle. The idea that taxes should be levied on a person according to how well the person can shoulder the burden. But in this case, when we talk about shouldering the burden, we can talk about vertical and horizontal equities. So in this case, there are things like proportional tax, regressive tax, progressive tax, and also the horizontal equity. But there are a number of complications. When we say that people with the same ability to pay should be paying the same taxes, in a number of cases, we can promote large family norms. We can promote people not to work. And so this again becomes a consideration while deciding how to use or how to design the tax system. Another thing is, should we go for average taxes or marginal taxes? Now, if we go for marginal taxes, then it is possible that we may discourage the people from working, which again will be bad for the society. Then another thing is whether we should have a tax on income or a tax on consumption. Now, in a number of cases, we have found that a tax on consumption is better because it promotes a habit of saving in the people. But for a large number of countries, we are already having a tax on income. So, is it simple? Is it worthwhile to shift from a tax on income to a tax on consumption? Probably not. So, a number of these questions are not just economic questions but also philosophical questions. In the ninth module, we looked at industrial organization and conservation. Now, this is important because in a large number of cases, we have observed that industries, in their zeal for reducing the cost to increase the profits or maximize the profits, they take those decisions that are bad for the environment. So we have looked at things like the Minamata disaster or the Bhopal gas tragedy or the Love Canal disaster. And in all of these cases, there was a thought of going for a cost cutting at the risk of destroying the environment or destroying the society. Now, because industries have been making such choices, so when we talk about conservation, we need to understand why the industries are making these choices. How do industries decide what should be the level at which they should be doing the production? How do industries decide how many laborers to hire? How do industries decide what is the level of cost cutting that they should be going for? And so in this module, we looked at the cost of producing goods and we looked at two different markets. One is a competitive market and the second one is a monopolistic market. Now, in the case of a firm, the cost of production is related to the cost benefit analysis, which is a study that compares the costs and benefits of providing a good or service. So the industries at all points of time, they are doing the cost benefit analysis. Should I produce one extra item? Is it going to increase my profits or is it going to reduce my profits? Should I go for installation of a pollution controlling device? Because when I install this device, is it going to bring me profits or is it going to reduce my profits? Now, in this case, when we talk about externalities, a number of industries would try to use externalities as a loophole, because in that case, the negative outcomes are borne by the society, but the positive outcomes accrue to the industry in the form of cost cutting. So they might go for it. And such cost cuttings have led to things such as the environmental disasters. Now, in this context, we looked at total revenue, total cost, and the profit. Total revenue is the amount a firm receives from the sale of its output. And the firm always tries to increase the total revenue. So that is the amount of money that is getting into the company. A part of this amount is used to pay for things. So that is total cost, the market value of the inputs a firm uses in production. And the difference is what the company can keep to itself. So that is total profit, total revenue minus total cost. And the company is trying to maximize the total profit. That is to increase revenue as far as possible and to reduce the cost as far as possible. Now, in this case, reduction of the cost can at times lead to severe cost cuttings that will have environmental consequences. Now, in the case of cost, there are two kinds of cost, explicit and implicit cost. Explicit costs are those that require an outlay of money by the firm, such as wages or cost of raw materials. And implicit costs are costs that do not require an outlay of money, such as things like the opportunity cost. And because of this, whether we incorporate the implicit cost in the computations or not, we have two different kinds of profit. We have the accounting profit and we have the economic profit. Now, the accounting profit only looks at the explicit cost. It just ignores the implicit cost. Whereas the economic profit also includes the implicit cost in the computations. So in a number of cases, we will find that the economic profit is less than the accounting profit. So this is a major difference that we should keep in mind. And we looked at the marginal product, which is the increase in the output that arises from an additional unit of input. That is, if we increase the input, what is the change in the output? And here we have the law of the diminishing marginal product. That is, when we increase the inputs, then as the inputs are increased, they work less efficiently. That is, the amount of output that they will increase or the marginal output, it will go on reducing. And so the marginal product, it is reducing as the number of workers increases. But this is also true with the other inputs as well. Now, we can plot the production function, which is another way of showing the same thing. So the output per hour, it goes on increasing, but the rate of increasing is decreasing. So the rate of increase, it goes on reducing with each step, and after all, the curve becomes flatter. Now, we can convert the production curve into the total cost curve, and this shows that with increasing output, the cost increases exponentially, which tells us that every firm will have to decide how much to produce. Because after a while, an extra production will increase cost much more than will be the increase in the revenue. And in this context, we looked at fixed cost, variable cost, total cost, and marginal cost. And the average fixed cost, the goes on decreasing. So this is the average fixed cost, which goes on decreasing. The average variable cost increases with more number of outputs. The average total cost, it decreases, but then it increases. So there is a minimum, and there is a marginal cost, that is the cost of producing one extra item. And the firms decide on the level of their output by looking at these different costs. And we'll look at two different markets to understand that. So one is the competitive market. So in the case of a competitive market, there are a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers. The number of buyers and sellers is so large that any one buyer or any group of buyers or sellers will not be able to influence the market prices. So everybody here is a price taker. Whatever price the market decides, they will have to take that price. So the buyers can buy as much as they want from the market at the market price. And the sellers can sell as much as they want to sell at the market price. They cannot bargain, they cannot haggle because the market price has to be taken by them. So this is a competitive market. Now we looked at the benefits of competition, and in this case, in a competitive market, the price is constant. Now the total revenue given by this green curve, it increases with the level of output because the price is fixed. So the more you produce, the more is the total revenue. The total cost, it goes on increasing as we have seen a short while back. And the profit is given by the difference between the total revenue and the total cost. And so we'll observe that the profit increases, reaches to a maximum, and then it starts to decrease. And this tells us that there is a level of production that will maximize the profit, and the firms go with that level of production. Now, in this case, we can say that if this is the marginal cost, the point where the marginal cost crosses the profit curve, the marginal revenue curve or the price curve is the point where we will have the maximization of the profit. Because to the left of this point, we have a situation where the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost. Now, if the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, it means that if the firm produces one extra item, then it will gain more revenue at a lesser cost. And so there will be an increase in profit. So the firm would want to increase the production. And to the right of this point, we will have a situation where the marginal cost is greater than the marginal revenue. That is, the firm will come to the realization that we have produced a bit too much. So let us reduce the production. And so to the left, they are trying to increase production. To the right, they are trying to decrease the production. And ultimately, the most efficient point becomes this point where the marginal cost and the marginal revenue curves are intersecting each other. So this is the uh, level of efficient production in a competitive firm. And the maximum profitability is also at this point where the price and the marginal cost curves, they are touching each other. In this context, we also said that if you look at the average total cost curve, the marginal cost curve, it intersects it at the minimum. And we looked at profitability in the long run and in the short run. Now, in the long run, the firm should shut down if the revenue is not able to meet the total cost of running. That is, if the price is less than the average total cost of production, then the firm should shut the operations because it is not getting sufficient money to meet the average total cost. And in this case, we will have a supply curve like this. So above uh, uh, above this point where which is the minimum of the average total cost, the firm will supply according to the marginal cost, and below this, it will shut production. Now, in the short run, the firm will say that okay, we are not able to meet the average total cost, but are we at least able to meet the average variable cost? If that is so, we will at least carry on our production for some more time because after some time it is possible that the market situations will change. And so in this case, the short run profitability is given by this point where the average variable cost and the price curves meet. And in this case, the firm should uh, close the production when the price is less than the average variable cost. And in this case, we get this supply curve. So this is the average variable cost, and above the above the minimum of the average variable cost, the firm will supply according to the marginal cost, and below this, it will shut down the production. Then we also looked at the profit. Profit is the price minus ATC, which is the average total cost, multiplied by quantity, and loss is average total cost minus price into quantity. And in the long run, because firms are regularly entering and exiting the market, we will have a situation that the price will be fixed at the minimum of the average total cost of production. Now, in this case, the firms are operating at a profit of zero, but they are still operating, because when we talk about this profit, we are talking about the economic profit. So they are also incorporating the implicit cost. So what a person could have earned somewhere else, he is earning here in the market as well. So it is okay to produce things. Next, we had a look at the monopolist market. A monopoly is defined as a firm that is the sole seller of a product without any close substitutes, such as a firm that is selling a patented medicine. So, when a firm is the sole seller of something and there are no other substitutes or close substitutes, in that case, the buyers have no other option than to buy the product from that firm only. And so, in such a scenario, the firm can dictate the prices. So, in the case of monopoly, a firm is not a price taker, the firm is a price maker. And so, its thoughts about profitability or an efficient production will be very different from that of a competitive firm. Because in the case of a competitive firm, the price is fixed. But in the case of a monopolistic firm, they can change the prices, they can change the quantity that they are going to supply. Now, what happens in the case of monopolies is that we have monopolies because of three main reasons. One is monopoly over resources. So, if there is a firm that has control over the resources that are necessary for production of something, then this firm will be a monopoly. In certain cases, government promotes monopoly, such as in the case of copyrights and patents. So, the government gives the right to a certain person to produce this good for say 20 years. So the government creates monopolies. And the third thing is natural monopolies. In certain markets or in certain sectors, the thing is that if there are more number of sellers, then the average prices increase. It is much more efficient to have just a single seller than to have multiple sellers. And in that case, we will have a situation of natural monopolies, because the average total cost decreases very quickly with the increase in quantity, and so everybody would want to have a larger quantity of production by the firm, and a larger quantity of production by the firm is only possible when there are less number of firms. Otherwise, each will be producing a smaller quantity, in which case the average total cost will be much higher. Now, in the case of competitive firm, they faced a demand curve that was flat because the price was fixed. But in the case of a monopoly, the demand curve of the market is the actual demand curve that the monopolist firm faces. So now the monopolist can decide that okay, we are going to supply at this price, at which case they will be able to sell this much amount of quantity of goods. Or the monopolist might say that we are going to supply at this price, and in for this price the quantity will also be this much. And so the firm may choose either the quantity that will determine the price, or it may choose the price that will determine the quantity. But the thing here is that if more quantity of goods are supplied, then the price reduces. And when there is a reduction in the price, it impacts all the goods that they are selling. That it is not impacting just the next good that they are selling at the reduced price, but all the goods that they have sold so far, they will also have a reduced price. And in this context, we looked at the monopolist firm's revenue, and we saw that the marginal revenue for a monopolist is less than the average revenue, because of which this curve is sloping downwards. Now, profit maximization here as well, it is at the point where the marginal cost and the marginal revenue uh, lines cut each other. Because to the left of this point, we have a situation where the marginal revenue is greater than the marginal cost, which means that if the firm produces one extra good, then they are going to increase their profits. At any point to the right of this point, we have a situation where the marginal cost is greater and the marginal revenue is less. And so the firm would decide that, okay, we have produced a bit too much, let us reduce the production. So to the left of this point, the firm is trying to increase the production. To the right of this point, the firm is trying to reduce the production. So the optimum level is given by this point where the marginal cost and marginal revenue curves are cutting each other. And this gives us the quantity, and the quantity gives us the price. Now, the thing with the monopolist firm is that there is a deadweight loss involved, because the society would have wanted this quantity given by this point where the demand and the marginal cost curves meet each other. But the monopolist is supplying according to this point where the marginal revenue and the marginal cost curves are cutting each other. And we have seen that the marginal revenue is less than the um, demand curve. And so there is a deadweight loss that is involved. Now, the firm may try to go for price discrimination to reduce this consumer surplus, or in certain cases, the government may impose things such as antitrust laws to break monopolies or price control, or may go for public ownership or nationalization, or may even do nothing, depending on the political philosophy that the government has. So once we know how the industry operates, we can think about why the industry is going for a cost cutting. And if we try to internalize the externalities that are involved with the cost cutting decisions, we can bring the companies to a point where they are helping in the conservation of environment also. Because the firms are here to stay, whether we talk about a competitive market or a monopolist market. We cannot say that, okay, the firms are doing pollution, so we should shut down the firms. That is not going to happen. So the conservationist has to bring up a solution in the context of the working of the industry. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.